regulations on capital ratios until the 1980s. And that actually took me by surprise. There was no regulation of capital ratios until the late 1980s, in fact. And interestingly, when adjusted for the type of asset held, especially the dominance of gilt-edged securities during and after the Second World War, the adjusted capital ratios were actually quite high and safe, and that actually a lot of the regulation had the effect of adversely, or we would say adversely anyway, making them apparently less safe. But anyway, the main thing is that the conditions for regulatory adverse selection are often almost mistakenly imposed, by almost in error or unthinkingly imposed. I mean, assets, for example, in the case of the Basel rules in 1988, assets were assigned to risk classes, and the higher the supposed risk of default, the larger the capital reserve associated with it. This seems very logical, but KPM would point out that the rules as set up initially paid attention only to the nature of the borrower, whether a sovereign government or a company or an individual. Under this system, all governments were equally safe. So if you lend to governments, you just looked at what proportion of your lending was to governments. It doesn't matter whether it was the United States or whether it was Botswana or wherever. All governments were equally safe and all companies were equally risky. I'm not saying that this system continues to this day. I'm saying that this is where it starts. Well, this kind of regulatory assertion of parity between unlike things, or indeed, in principle, lack of parity between like things, establishes the conditions for adverse selection. Okay, well, what am I going to conclude? Well, look, these critiques of regulation are hardly new. You can critique regulation from a public choice point of view, from the point of view of the new institutional economics, obviously where I come from. But I've been, in this lecture, concentrating perhaps on a rather confined issue, but nevertheless I think it's quite an important one. State regulation is not usually introduced into a totally unregulated environment. An intervention will have effects on already evolved institutions. And basically, regulators risk crowding out these trust-inducing mechanisms and substituting less effective measures. Indeed, the very presence of state regulation, especially regulation that is trusted, mistakenly maybe, by consumers, is capable of setting up the conditions under which moral hazard leads to the shading of actual as distinct from measured regulatory quality. And market processes no longer buttress but erode quality. So instead of the thousands of millions of eyes exerting as many wills, as von Wieser says, mentioned by Wieser, quality becomes dependent upon the efficiency of state agencies. This possibility that regulation undermines quality by substituting for more effective, privately evolved mechanisms is regulatory adverse selection. And in a more correct sense than George Akerlof's, it indeed represents, I would have said, a modified reappearance of Gresham's law.
We have time for one, perhaps two questions.
Franz University in Prague. How would you argue, or what would you say to an argument that the mechanisms that you mentioned, the market mechanisms that are able to cope with adverse selection and moral hazard, etc., that they worked in a world that was simpler than it is today, that the newly created regulations are only trying to cope with the increased risk due to globalization, the ability to trade overseas very easily, the ability to sell anything to anyone very quickly and then disappear.
dare say we live in a more complicated world. I mean, in a way, the story I told you about the 19th century cooperatives was an indication that we're moving into a more complicated world. These decisions are made about more and more complex things, and you move into the 20th century, you get electronics coming in, and so how do people make choices? How do they know how dangerous the electrics are, and so on? And I think the answer is that there is no final answer. I mean, I give a co-answer really that it's only by sort of looking at individual cases you can really tell. I mean, but I think the thrust of my argument is that the problem is we're not really even looking at that. I'm not standing here trying to maintain that there is no problem ever with markets, then the government shouldn't have a role. I mean, if you look at something, you look at a famous article by Warren Coase on the regulation of telecommunications, effectively. I mean, one of the things interesting about that argument, he's very critical of the federal communications authorities. But he does say, well, maybe a regulation absolutely settling that there must be a certain amount of shielding to prevent interference or something might be necessary at some point. So even someone like Coase is prepared to say, well, one has to look at it in a sense in a case-by-case basis. But he was coming from a situation where you had absolute regulatory, control and this assumption that if you ever departed from allocating frequencies by simply administrative fear, that there would be chaos. His point is, no, we need markets to get the information and to make sure there isn't chaos. But at the same time, in the same article, I don't think it's even in a footnote, he's prepared to say, well, of course, sometimes transactions costs are so astonishingly high, it would be most unlikely perhaps we could solve it that way. Maybe a regulation occasionally is necessary. And if you're not totally ideological about it, you're closely, you're trying to get to a situation where you have an institutional setup which is transactions cost economizing. Well, of course, I can't sit here and say there's never such a complicated system that it wouldn't deserve some form of regulation. But I suppose the point of my paper is I think that most even academics don't even think like that. They tend to start from the assumption that the state will have knowledge that nobody else has, and it can be enforced. And if they're mistaken in that assumption that they can improve things, and they apply these standards, regrettably they will find that they set up just the conditions you require for a race to the bottom. So they don't do it deliberately, but that's what you will get. And then therefore they're undermining their own position, except of course they tend to strengthen it in an institutional sense, because when standards fall, then there's more regulation required. You see, they don't think, oh, well, perhaps we need these thousands of millions of miles out there. Maybe we need more skeptical consumers. Maybe people need to just use which and private websites and so on, which will establish some source of information which will actually be a lot better and induce suppliers, therefore, to be more careful. But I can see this a difficult. You asked a very difficult question, and there's no final answer.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for your talk. I'd like to acknowledge the cooperation of a couple of institutions which made this event possible, promoted the event. First, I'd like to acknowledge help of CEVRO Institut, which is the oldest Czech free market think tank. I also want to mention Purkyně University in Label for also helping promoting the event. And indeed, we have media partner, Parlamentaristy, which is becoming a key partner of activities of CEVRO Institute. However, most of all, I would like to appreciate help of newly emerging institutions here, as well as established institutions in Europe and in the whole world, and that is Students for Liberty. Today, I'd like to invite to the podium Jan Škapa, who is representing European Students for Liberty, and he will share with us a few words and a few remarks about what the institution is and what it does. Jan, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jan Škapa, and I am from European Students for Liberty, as already mentioned. First, let me introduce myself. I'm a student in Brno, and I study law at Masaryk University and management and IT at Brno University of Technology. I serve as the current chairman of Students for Liberty Czech Republic, and I am the local coordinator at European Students for Liberty and executive board member elect. Well, first, I would like to tell something about what the organizations are. European Students for Liberty is a part of Students for Liberty International, which provides students all over the world with resources and training. Students for Liberty Czech Republic is a local nationwide group which focuses on day-to-day operations and organizing events and connecting students. I would like to tell you something about the philosophy which connects both organizations, which is how do we believe the change towards more freedom is possible. Well, we believe no single politician or political party can change things on their own. That's, I think, very well illustrated by public choice theory and what incentives really matter in politics. I believe we need more leaders of liberty in all fields, not only politics and academia, but also journalism and business and arts, for example. And how do we think to reach this goal? Where our theory of social change is based on that our generation, first, is the most libertarian generation there was. But it takes time to change the common worldview held in society. But we believe that by working towards that goal, we can inspire others, and students are the public intellectuals of tomorrow, which will subsequently affect the ideas held in our society. So that's what we think how we can change, how we can progress towards more freedom. And now let me just tell you something about European Students for Liberty very quick. European Students for Liberty connects over 200 groups from over 40 countries in Europe into a whole European network. We have over 60 local coordinators in 27 countries, and we organize an annual European Students for Liberty conference. Last one was in Berlin last month, and it was attended by over 550 students from all over Europe and actually all over the world. This is our team of local coordinators who are the leaders who are trying to promote liberty in their respective countries. What you can do, either if you are a student, you can apply and be a local coordinator for Students for Liberty, or if you are a teacher, you can tell your students about this opportunity to become local coordinators and lead their student liberty movements in their countries. Well, let's now talk about Students for Liberty Czech Republic. Students for Liberty Czech Republic is one of those 200 student organizations in the European Students for Liberty Network. It has 15 local faculty coordinators at 7 universities in 4 cities in the Czech Republic. The cities are Prague, Ostrava, Brno, and Ricketts. We're trying to connect people who want to do lectures, who want to do networking events here in the Czech Republic. This is our team when we met in Brno for a leadership forum. We do different, this is when we went to the European Students for Liberty Conference. This is Czech and Slovak representatives in Berlin at the European Students for Liberty Conference. We do different kinds of events, most lectures or networking events and tablings, and we also we are very much welcoming new ideas on what to do and how to promote the ideas of liberty on campuses all over the Czech Republic. This is some pictures from the events we're doing in Prague, and both in Prague and Brno we do liberty evenings, which are informal meetings trying to, where we try to discuss some topics connected to liberty. This is from Brno, where we meet usually at around 40 or 30 people meet usually every 2 weeks. We do lectures, which are attended by many students at plenty of universities here, both in Prague, Brno, Strava, and elsewhere. We do tablings where we talk to students directly, and we also do socializing events like this one week, which we did at Brno shooting range. If you don't believe me that we are a good organization and interesting organizations to do something with, we actually went to the International Students for Liberty Conference in Washington, D.C. held in February, where our organization, Students for Liberty Czech Republic, won the Students for Liberty Awards for the best student group of the year on the whole planet. So I hope this will convince you that you can, that our organization is worthwhile, and how you could benefit from actually joining or doing something in Students for Liberty for your students. How could they benefit? Well, they can learn new ideas about liberty, and they can write about those ideas and educate others. They can network and create relationships amongst like-minded people, and they can lead and gain experience by leading in the liberty movement. Many SFLers actually gotten jobs by doing their SFL work or started their own businesses together, so that's also an advantage. And it's important to act out your passion. If your passion is liberty, it's very important to act on it. Well, what can you do? You can talk to me after the lectures are over, or tell your students about these opportunities. You can contact me at jscappa@studentsforliberty.org, or you can find me on social networks. The name is the same. And if you want to check out our website, it's www.studentsforliberty.org/Europe for European Students for Liberty, and www.studentsforliberty.cz, twice CZ. So that's a thing to look out for when typing the address. And you can check out what we are doing here and abroad. So thank you for allowing me to speak to you, and that's it for me. Enjoy the conference.
All right, thank you, Jan. Now it's time to introduce our second speaker. We are slightly behind schedule, so I will skip my list of over 100 articles by Professor Munger, which I wanted to read you. So the short version of who the next speaker is the following one. Mike Munger is professor in the Department of Political Science and professor in the Department of Economics and Public Policy at Duke University. He is also director of a PPE program at Duke. He received his PhD in economics at the Washington University in St. Louis. Then he, following his graduate training, he worked as a staff economist at the Federal Trade Commission. He taught at different places, however, he ended up at Duke in 1997, and he was the chair of the political science department from 2000 through 2010. He has won several university-wide teaching awards. He is the past president of the Public Choice Society. His research interests include the study of the morality of exchange and the working of legislative institutions, Much of his recent work has been in philosophy, examining the concept of truly voluntary exchange, which is also a topic of his today's talk. He is a member of several editorial boards recently, and that makes us especially happy. He became a co-editor of the Independent Review. He published 6 books, and today he is recipient of Franz Cuhel PCPE 2014 Prize for Excellence in Economic Education. Professor Munger, please approach me.
Thanks for the introduction. I think we were appropriately matched with the prizes that were awarded here. I was interested in the introduction. I had looked up, of course, Franz Cuhel, and I thought Dr. Shima was sort of honest in saying that this was a semi-forgotten scholar, but clearly in the case of Franz Cuhel, he doesn't deserve to be forgotten. His work deserves to be remembered. I'd like to think that my semi-forgotten work is on its own merit. It deserves to be forgotten. The talk for today that I'm going to talk about is a concept that I came up with, voluntary exchange. And the subtitle is one that I added. And I think it's an interesting question. One of the things that interests me is the problem of things that we allow people to exchange but not pay for. Things that we allow people to exchange but not to pay for. So, in economics, voluntary exchange is the basis of most of the argument that we make for markets. So the fact that both parties to a voluntary exchange are made better off are the reasons why we're going to develop institutions that will facilitate those exchanges, because the more of them that take place, the more value is created. So any time a voluntary exchange takes place, value is created. Both parties to it are better off. And economists often, from a philosophical point of view, simply beg the question that the exchange is voluntary. If an exchange takes place, it's voluntary. That is by no means universally accepted. So when we say voluntary, we sort of slur over it because we just mean exchange. But philosophers, when they talk about voluntary exchange, actually mean something rather different. And it's that difference that I'm going to try to close today, to try to explain what it means to be truly voluntary. So in particular, the way economists beg this question is often to talk about markets that are competitive. Now, in a competitive market, there are many buyers and many sellers, and the good is relatively homogeneous, which means that each of us have good alternatives. And what philosophers mean by an exchange that is involuntary is just we may not have very many good alternatives. So that's the difference that I want to explore. Now, another difficulty is that when I say both parties are better off, I'm invoking a conception of better off that is subjective. But the notion that we're going to allow people to decide whether or not they're better off is itself controversial. So we have many laws that maybe they're paternalistic, maybe they actually make some sense. If I'm a heroin addict, do I really want to buy heroin? Well, one way that we would test that, or the way that philosophers would suggest that we test that, is to invoke a second-order preference or meta-preference. Does the heroin addict want heroin? So if I don't want heroin, but in fact I want it because of a compulsion or addiction, we might act to say that's not really an objective benefit. So if I'm an addict, I'm acting on this not out of a preference that I want to have. So that's something that I'm going to come back to. Do I regret having this desire? Now, the picture that has been flashing across actually was from about 4 or 5 years ago. I weighed about 20 kilos more then than I weigh now, because my wife threatened to get a Match.com account, and I understand competition, and so I don't think she actually went through with it, but we are clearly both better off that I lost so much weight, but it's very difficult for me to pass a pastry shop. I don't want the pastry, but I really do want it. So the question is, are we going to allow subjective benefits in every case? Well, the name for that is autonomy. Autonomy means we credit people's subjective preferences. And the question really is, the problem really is an exchange voluntary if we would not, under normal circumstances, credit the autonomy of the person that wants it? That is, we're not sure they want that. And if they could, and you're a cigarette smoker perhaps, and you don't want to smoke, the fact that you want cigarettes contradicts the fact that you don't want cigarettes. And so it's a problem. The deeper problem is, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but let me go through it quickly, voluntary and coercive seem like antonyms. And I think it's fair to say that the real situation is more complicated than that. Under some circumstances, we might want to be coerced, or at least we might want to put ourselves in a situation where we might be coerced. If I sign a contract with someone, then one of the ways that we reduce the transactions cost of that contract is to have an external enforcement agreement. Now, that doesn't necessarily require the state, but there's some kind of external enforcement, which means that if I fail to carry out the terms of the contract, or if you fail to carry out the terms of the contract, we'll be subject to some kind of sanction. Now, if we see the sanction being carried out, we might conclude that that's coercive, but I volunteered to be coerced. So this is often spun up to a kind of social contract theory, where consent is simply assumed. But it's not entirely wrong to say that if you have consented, then the coercion is in some sense voluntary. I might agree to the fact that we need some sort of speed limit, and then we have some procedure for deciding. I might not agree. I might think that the speed limit should be 140 kilometers per hour, and it turns out to be only 110 kilometers per hour, but it would not be an adequate defense if I'm pulled over by the policeman. You were doing 140 kilometers per hour. I said, yeah, I didn't consent to that. I thought it should be 150, and so I actually wasn't speeding in my own terms. And he would say, well, I have a term for you, here's a ticket. So, no, that's more of a gray area. That's coercive in the sense that sort of Rousseau's great question, how can it be that a man is both free and bound by wills not his own? That's coercion. Well, I'm being bound by the fact that I'm subject to procedures that I agreed to, and then outcomes that I might not have agreed to. So that's the basic public choice question that James Buchanan gave to us, is under what circumstances do we give our consent to outcomes we disagree with because we've agreed to the rules? Now, if we haven't agreed with the rules, that's a whole separate question. But the role of consent may be at the level of constitutions and rulemaking procedures, not at the level of outcomes. Because these are collective choices. We can't each have our own separate speed limit. The way that if we go to a restaurant, each of us can have our own separate choice from the menu. So, is coercion always involuntary? And I think what matters here is a convention about starting from where we are. Now, let's suppose that I have a gun. Dr. Shima has a purse. I'm sure he has some lovely purses and some green pumps to match. So, I have a gun, he has a purse, and now I have a gun and a purse. Because he made a voluntary choice. Knowing that I would shoot him if he doesn't give me the purse, he makes, and there was an old American comic, Jack Benny, who would be posed with this, your money or your life. I'm thinking, because he was supposed to be a miser. Well, he would probably give up the purse. The question is that a voluntary exchange? Well, remember, all I said was that I have a gun and he has a purse. You attributed property to him, but I didn't say that it was his property. Suppose he's a thief and I'm a policeman. We've agreed that property is going to be protected by the police. He actually did volunteer to be coerced if he agreed on the institution of property. So, you have to be careful once we think about the institution of property, about that agreement, then if I violate that, I'm in effect agreeing to be coerced. If I try to steal someone else's property, and I've agreed to the institution of property, if I try to violate that agreement, then I'm subject to coercion that I agreed to in advance. And in fact, without that, liberty is not possible. Without that sort of agreement, liberty is not possible. Unless we can have property and contracts that are going to be subject to sanctions that we have agreed to or consented to in advance, then voluntary exchange itself is not possible. So, as James Buchanan always said, we need to start from where we are. Now, how he acquired the property is a separate question. There may be ethical problems with how it was acquired, but the allocation of property that we have some kind of agreement on. We're going to try to move forward from there. This, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, was Circe's warning to Odysseus. On the Odyssey, Odysseus was told that he was going to pass by the island of the Sirens. And you may recall, this is from a mosaic. So here we have Odysseus, he's bound to the mast. Here are his men, they're all looking away. They're rowing, they have their ears stopped up with wax and cotton so that they cannot hear. But Odysseus can still hear, he's looking towards the Sirens, and he wants very much to jump overboard and swim and be killed. But the seductive power of the siren song is so strong that he knows he can't resist it. And because he knows he can't resist it, he told his men to do two things. First, tie me to the mast. Second, ignore all my further orders. Ignore all my further orders. Can I order you to ignore my further orders? It seems paradoxical. So I know that I'm going to want to cheat on this agreement that I'm making. And when I do, I want you to punish me. I want you to bind me ever more tightly to the mast. So the interesting thing is that for Odysseus, in order to be truly free, had to be able to order his men to tie him up in a way he could not escape. So the nature of voluntary exchange requires that we be able to choose about whether or not to be coerced. The question is, how can we remove our consent? How can we secede from that sort of agreement? Is it irrevocable? Is it permanent? Does it last forever? These are big problems. I also like this picture because the Sirens have these little chicken legs. And they're otherwise quite womanly, so men's standards may not be that high. They'll accept chicken legs. So there's some sort of this is a well-known fact about men. I'll not dwell on it more. So Odysseus is kicking and screaming, but he's not being coerced. The question is, what do citizens agree to when they constitute themselves as a group? What activities are legitimate, what can be prohibited or regulated in a market economy? So the claim is that prohibitions, coercion, regulation, all have to be logically enabled by the original agreement. So the question I want to ask is, under what circumstances might prices and market exchanges be regulated even if they appear to be voluntary and therefore mutually beneficial? What are the requirements for something to be truly voluntary? Because my claim is that autonomy should, both as a matter of ethics and efficiency, be respected whenever the exchange is truly voluntary. So it's an if-then sort of logical claim. Whenever the exchange is truly voluntary, then both as a matter of ethics, that is the personal autonomy of the participants, and efficiency, the production of economic value, the state should not interfere. Now, there are people, I would think, who would say that no exchange could ever be voluntary, and obviously I'm not capable of addressing that. But for someone who would say yes, the real problem is that most exchanges are not truly voluntary. There may be some common ground for which we might start, if we can establish that something could be truly voluntary. So, let me see if I can just start this.
A 17-year-old Chinese high school student has sold one of his kidneys. The reason? So he could buy an iPad an iPhone. The boy, identified only as Xiao Zheng, a broker on the internet who said he could help him sell his kidney for $3,000 US. So in late April, Zheng traveled to Shenzhou in central Hunan province, where he had his right kidney removed in a hospital and was paid $3,400. His mother told reporters she's devastated by the news.
When my son came home, he had a laptop computer and another phone. Where did all that money come from? Only when he could bear it no longer did he tell us. He said, "Mom, I sold my kidney. When I heard it, I felt like the sky was crashing down on our family."
A broker who organizes the sale of kidneys in Beijing told reporters by telephone that Zheng didn't get a great deal. The price is $5,400, he says, plus the bonus. The bonus is between $300 and $1,500. Zheng's mother alerted police after she found out, but they were unable to locate the broker. The hospital was not authorized to perform organ transplants and claimed they had no idea about the surgery. Travis Brecker, Reuters.
So to reprise, kid was 17, wanted an iPod, sold his kidney in an arrangement in which he got cheated in a hospital that was not qualified to perform the operation. So there are many things wrong with this transaction. The reason I think the example is interesting is I think almost everyone would say, okay, the state might have some role in regulating this. The question is, how many parameters do you have to change before you would allow it? It's sort of a Rorschach test. What would you have to change? Suppose he's 35. He's going to sell his kidney so he can obtain medicine to save, very expensive medicine to save his daughter who is failing eyesight can be fixed by the medicine. If he can obtain it, he obtains the full normal market price, and it's done at a hospital where this is fully authorized and licensed and they have experience. Would you then say that the kidney sale should be allowed? And for many people, the answer is no. There's something about this where they would say the fact that he is obliged to sell his kidney means that he must be desperate. Only the complete absence of other alternatives would induce him to want to sell this. Now, it seems paradoxical that in our desire to help him, we say, no, he should not have to sell his kidney. We then skip to, and therefore he should not be able to sell his kidney when that's the only means by which he can save his daughter's eyesight in the example. But the point is that this is the sort of mutually beneficial exchange that the state often says we're not going to allow. And there are parameters here that might make you say, I have some sympathy with that. Maybe there's some contracts that are unconscionable. But how many things would you have to change? So, why are some transactions okay? We could buy soft drinks, cars, car washes. There are other things we can't buy. Plutonium or crystal meth. Well, plutonium and crystal meth make sense. You can't own them, so it makes sense that you can't buy them. It's a little bit odd that there are some things, prostitution, organ sales, where the underlying thing itself is fine. The problem is to pay for it. So if two people go out on a date and afterwards they decide to have sex, that's fine. The only problem is if one of them pays the other. And in fact, Duke, my university, has recently become famous by having a young lady who is an actress. She has been acting in pornographic movies, and one could imagine, in fact, the sort of distinctions the law is trying to make here. So the police break in. A sex act has just taken place and the young lady was paid for it. And they say, no, there's a camera. We're filming pornography. It's not prostitution. Oh, okay. Do you need like a policeman to come in? Because I could... Well, never mind. Because he wants to be in the movie. Well, the point is that we allow under some circumstances the person to be paid for exactly the same sex act, although it might be more acrobatic in the case of the pornography. And it's fine for the two people to participate in the mutually beneficial act, assuming that it's good for both of them. What we don't allow is the payment. It's odd that we do that. And the question is, why would prostitution be illegal? If it's mutually beneficial, we ought to respect autonomy. Well, the answer usually is, from the people who oppose prostitution, is that it's not truly voluntary, because no woman would do that unless she was desperate. Well, it's possibly true. It's an interesting judgment for us to reach. What I'm more interested in is not the particular example, but the logic. Suppose that it's true that only a desperate person would do that. Should we then disallow it? The question is, should we then disallow it? Or should the market, when is the market guide, market price a guide for moral action? Well, I'm a narcissist, and so I'm the sort of person who Googles myself 4 or 5 times a day, and I have the reports. Even minor misspellings of my name, I want to make sure that, okay, that's not true, I ended those. But I found the origins of my own name, Munger, M-G-E-R, to be the English word monger. In fact, the Mongers come from County Surrey in southern England. The first one came to the U.S. in 1651, Nicholas Munger, and he very wisely married a young rich girl, which is an excellent thing for an immigrant to do. But in the 11th century, the name Munger actually comes from the Saxon word Mankir, meaning merchant. And the Mankirs lived in the Hansa, the cities of northern Europe, and they were sort of simple merchants. And here's from a history of the Anglo-Saxons presentation by the Mankir. The people weren't given names. So the Mankir here is like a character, a type in the Canterbury Tales. They're just reporting, this is what Mankirs are like. So the Munger says, and I have a hard time not reading this in a Monty Python voice. I'm going to do my best. I can make no promise. So I say I'm useful to the king, and to aldermen, and to the rich, and to all people. I ascend to my ship with my merchandise, and I sail over the sea-like places. That's an odd translation. I sail over the sea-like places. I sell my things. I buy dear things which are not produced in this land, and I bring them to you here with great danger over the sea. Sometimes I suffer shipwreck. I died 3 times, but I got better. With the loss of all my things, and scarcely escaping myself. So I bring these things to you with great danger. And then the interlocutor says, what things do you bring to us? Skins, silks, costly gems and gold, various garments, pigment. So a bunch of things that are not really necessities. Presumably that you would only buy if you really wanted. Will you sell your things here as you brought them here? Will you sell your things here as you brought them here? This question is pregnant with meaning. Is he going to improve them in any way? No hint of production here. He goes somewhere else and buys them and brings them here. Well, the question is, what price should he be allowed to charge? What price should he be allowed to charge? And he's advocating for the highest price the market will bear. So he says, no, I'm not going to change them. I'm going to charge a really high price. I will not, because what would my labor benefit me? I will sell them dearer here than I bought them there, that I may get some profit to feed me, my wife, and children. Now, when I read this, I think, cool, what a great guy, what a modern view. This is 1050, 1050, almost 1,000 years ago. So this account of profit as being both an incentive and a reward for creating value is a very modern perspective on trade, on exchange. Other people in reading this see a justification for state action. He's charging too much. Well, what does that even mean? Why would you decide that he's charging too much? Well, because he's charging the maximum that he can get. The case is per se. The case is prima facie. We know he's going to charge the most that he can get. Therefore, the state should act. Well, that's the intuition that I think is interesting. So I came up with a new word. So I took the Greek prefix EU, meaning well, truly pleasing, and the Latin word voluntas, or will, for voluntary. I've actually gotten the objection that this creates a monstrous word because it's a Greek prefix on a Latin suffix. If you think that, you need to go back and crawl into whatever Cambridge hole you came from. My thesis is that voluntary exchanges should never be interfered with by the state. That would be unjustified coercion. The question is, can we define that? So I have 6 conditions, and I'll go through them quickly. Conventional ownership in the sense that we both know what ownership means. Conventional ability to transfer, because otherwise exchange doesn't mean anything. Third, the absence of post-exchange regret. This has 2 meanings. One is, there's no asymmetric information that's not handled by market institutions. And there's no compulsion in the sense that I don't want this. So it's okay that I want that. I don't wish that I didn't want it. I don't regret having bought it. I have, on occasion, gone to a donut shop and eaten a dozen donuts and then thought, darn, I wish I had not eaten those dozen donuts. So I realize that's a pretty extreme definition. What I'm trying to do is get to the point where everybody will agree that this is voluntary. So I'm not advocating this as a requirement. I'm saying this is a set of sufficient conditions that everybody can agree that it's voluntary. Fourth, the absence of uncompensated externalities, in the sense that if there's an externality that someone's imposed on someone else against their will, that can't be voluntary. Neither party is coerced in the sense of being forced to exchange by threat. So if I hold the gun to your head to get the purse, that can't be voluntary. And then I add a 6th condition, and that is you are not coerced by circumstance. You're not coerced by the threat that withholding access to the exchange does you harm. So, Michael Sandel, the Harvard economist, makes this objection pretty well. The first objection to the claim that exchange is voluntary is an argument from coercion. Points to the injustice that can arise when people buy and sell things under conditions of severe inequality or dire economic necessity. According to this objection, market exchanges are not necessarily as voluntary as market enthusiasts. It's terrible to be an enthusiast. Suggest. A peasant may agree to sell his kidney or cornea in order to feed his starving family, but his agreement is not truly voluntary. He's coerced in effect by the necessities of his situation. So, I'm reminded of the distinction that John Stuart Mill famously made, although Mill actually qualifies this in a number of ways, but the distinction is what's important. I don't want to attribute the opinion to Mill, but he does make the distinction. We should use economics and markets because of the efficiency in production, but then our decision about how to distribute the benefits, that should be up to society as a whole, because we want to make sure that we produce efficiently but then distribute ethically. And so that's going to be the justification for regulating price, is that we want to make sure that we can do this ethically. So the things once there, mankind, individually or collectively, can do with them as they like. And an Austrian economist who reads this, the warning bells right away. Wait a minute, the things once there, really? How did they get there? What are the objectives of the participants? Why was this thing created? Why is it there here and not somewhere else? All the philosophy examples start with, we've got 2 people on a desert island, one of them has water, the other one doesn't. Really? How did they get there? Why does one of them have water? So, there's 2 points, severe inequality or dire economic necessity, that might make something not truly voluntary on condition 6. And it's condition 6 that I'm interested in exploring. So, let's give an example. I go to a grocery store to buy water. The price is $1,000 per bottle. $1,000 for a liter of water. Now I look at that and am I outraged? Water is a necessity. I can't do without it. No, I laugh. I can go somewhere else. It's easy for me to obtain water. Yes, it's a necessity, but competition and the fact that it's homogeneous and I'm sure that the water is actually potable and won't kill me, I have plenty of other alternatives. So I can go somewhere else and buy the water. I'm not so worried about it. So even though water is a necessity, I still have choices. Let's suppose we understand ownership, we understand exchange. I don't have a water addiction. It means I drink more water than I should. There's no gun to my head. This is a U-voluntary exchange. That's an example of a U-voluntary exchange. But suppose instead, let's do a philosophy example. We just make stuff up. I'm out in the desert. Now, for some reason, I'm rich, I'm dying of thirst, I happen to have quite a bit of cash in my pocket. I've been out there for 2 days, I got lost. I got lost through my own fault. I wasn't put out there by kidnappers or anything like that. I got lost. I know that I'm going to die because I don't have any water. And then I hear, like an aural mirage, the sound of a truck. And then over the horizon of the desert comes a taco truck. So a food truck, and it sells tacos. And there's a sign on the side that says, 2 specials today, 1, 3 tacos for $5. And the other is water, $1,000 per bottle, or 3 bottles for $2,500. So if you get the 3 bottles, you'll save $500. Well, now I look and I notice, oh my God, it's Machete. So I don't really want to argue with him. And I can't very well take the water because Machete will kick my ass.